Jimmy Crockett passed away this past just a few days ago as we record this. And we had done, was it last week on The Experience or was it this past week on the Drive-Thru?
It was the Drive-Thru on Tuesday.
Because we had just heard that he was sick and in the hospital and in bad shape. And so that's last week's Drive-Thru that came out on March the 2nd, or elsewise the clip is on YouTube, but it's a considerably lengthy discussion of Jimmy Crockett and some of my experiences working there at the time and the Carolina Territory and just the history of the Carolina Territory. But, it's kind of funny and ironic in a way that the wrestling war of the 80s that was really, I'm so over the Attitude Era and the Monday Night Wars. I didn't like the product in a lot of cases on either side. And even though I was on one side, I was at one point ambivalent about which one won. But the real wrestling war that shaped what we're still looking at today as modern wrestling was the one in the 80s with Jim Crockett Jr. and Vince McMahon Jr. Their fathers had both started in promotion in the 30s, and it came down to two second-generation promoters, two Southerners, but one that wanted to be a Northerner, one that was proud to be a Southerner. It was almost like, goddamn, it's a fucking trivia fact. In the Civil War, both of the presidents of the United States and the Confederate States were born in the state of Kentucky. And both of the promoters in the two-horse promotional race in the 80s were born in the state of North Carolina. But Vince had an unhappy childhood and could never get past that and had a grudge against the South since that time. And Jim Crockett Jr. came up in a well-to-do family with probably the relationship that Vince wishes he had with his wrestling promoter father, and loved and was proud of being from the South and would never have gone anywhere else and just wanted to promote wrestling, like we said, in the Carolinas. And I think that's another one of the ironic parts that, maybe it was personal with Vince and Jimmy Jr. because Vince could see some of himself and what he might have done or what he could have done or been or whatever in Jimmy. Would Vince, if Vince had a better relationship with his father, would he have wanted to conquer the world? Or would he have just been like Jim Crockett and happy to be a family business and well respected in his area and successful enough for people that didn't want to own the world? I don't know, but it's anyway, this is, who's left? Bill Watts, Jerry Jarrett of the great territory promoters. Who else? I'm trying to think. Vern's gone, Fritz is gone, Graham's gone.
Yeah. Antonio Inoki.
Well, the territories in the United States.
I'm just thinking promoters from that period of time.
Era. Yeah, Baba's gone.
Emile Dupree? Is he?
But anyway, I said this on Twitter. I said it last week on a program. I'll say it again. If Jim Crockett Promotions was still in business, I don't know that I would have ever left Charlotte. I loved working for that company, not only because the talent was great and the wrestling was outstanding and the territory, the people loved wrestling there, and I loved living in Charlotte, North Carolina. Since I've been back in recent years, it's gotten big. It looks like a big northern city now, but when I lived there, it was green and it was southern and the weather was mostly good and people were friendly and great places to eat. But the wrestling promotion there, you were a local superstar. You were more over than the local television news celebrities, or there was, as we mentioned, no professional sports back then in the Carolinas except for auto racing. But, even though the heels had heat and there were certain places you didn't want to be in public because of that heat, they respected the wrestlers in that territory too. They hated the heels and still respected them, if that makes any sense. But it wasn't like looked down on like a substandard form of entertainment. Or, the wrestlers were stars and wrestling was big, and that was because of Crockett Promotions and the way they took care of their business all those years. And to exist in anything as a business for 55 years with only 3 people running it, Jim Crockett Sr., John Ringley for a couple of years, Francis's husband, the son-in-law, and then Jim Jr., 3 people running a company in 55 years ain't bad. And the records they set and the attendances they had. So Jimmy Crockett did turn out to be, now that all things are considered, probably the second most successful wrestling promoter of the 20th century behind Vince McMahon Jr. So,
is there something to be said there for someone who had wrestling people? He was a wrestling promoter, but he wasn't really coming up with the angles and doing things. He was hands off in a lot of ways.
The only time that Jimmy Crockett was ever a booker in his life was that 6-week period between the time they fired Dusty and the time they brought George Scott in when TBS had bought the company. And he came to us, and at the time he said, I'm not a booker. He said, I've been given this spot. I'm going to do maintenance. A maintenance show in those days, you would know, a maintenance show would just keep everything going. Don't start anything and don't really cut anything off. Just keep it going. And, of course, he violated his own rule when he booked that match for Randy Rose to leave town. But he knew he wasn't a booker. He had bookers and he had wrestling experts his whole run in running the company. Whether he inherited George Scott when he first took over the company, and then there was a period of time there where they tried the deal where they had a couple of different bookers because they had even though it wasn't a big geographical territory, as we mentioned, North and South Carolina and Virginia, they would have up to 3 live events per night running. So for a period of time there, Ernie Ladd, I think, was booking part of the territory, and Wahoo was helping out, and Dory Funk Jr.
Dory Funk Jr. 83, yeah.
83 was actually the booker, the nominal booker when they did Starrcade, but that was an idea that had been fed to him by Dusty, and then he brought Dusty in, and Dusty, of course, brought JJ to be his assistant. But Crockett ran a great territorial business. We said all the reasons why that he couldn't keep up business-wise with Vince on the other show the other day, but it was a perfect setup for a territorial wrestling promotion. If business went down, his overhead was low at the start. Like I said, the 3 secretaries and Sandy Scott and the accountant and Gene Anderson being full-time employees, and then other guys, local promoters in different places. But if business got lean, overhead was low. He could still keep talent, keep running his shows. If business flourished, then everybody made money. It was the highest paying NWA territory. Really, if you were on top in Charlotte, the only place you were going to make more money just working one territory was working for Vince. And, those towns ran like clockwork. The TV shows, they were always on top of them. They had great relations with the TV stations. So it was a model territory promotion that grossed, as I mentioned, and this is lawsuit material, so this was under oath, $21 million in 1986 out of a converted convenience store. And that was not the only good year they had. They had every year in the 70s was steady. The guys on top in the 70s and early 80s were making $150,000 a year apiece or more. And like I mentioned, when I was there, me and the Midnight made close to $200,000 apiece in 1986, and I know Flair made 2.5 times that, and Dusty probably as much or more between wrestling and booking. So, that's the thing, and that's, if all of this other shit hadn't happened, we even mentioned on the show that even with Vince's national expansion and all the other territories going under, if Crockett had minded their own business and not have been talked into chasing Vince National and not bought all the other territories, Florida, Kansas City, maybe UWF, but then maybe not. At least they got some talent and good TV slots out of the deal, but still, it would have been through most of the decade of the 90s that they could have still stayed in business in the Carolinas. Vince didn't draw one crowd anywhere in the Carolinas territory until 1998. He barely ran live events in that territory and didn't draw any crowds of sizable nature until the middle of the Monday Night Wars. And it had been 10 years since Crockett, had sold. So it had to be a turnover of a complete generation who remembered. Let's face it, the folks in the Carolinas from the 60s on saw the absolute best in-ring talent on a regular basis, the best matches, the top television production of the time. They were used to the best, and they didn't want that, cartoon New York wrestling. That's what all Southern people thought of it, but especially the standard that had been set in the Carolinas, they didn't want the cartoon wrestling. That's why it took an entire new generation to come up and be caught up in Stone Cold and The Rock and all those other guys before they could sell tickets on a regular basis, on a large basis in the Carolinas. And that's not just opinion. And that's not just me saying, oh, our wrestling was better because I was there. It's fact. They would come to, on that first 80s expansion, remember they came haltingly into the Carolinas and Virginia. Ric Flair cussed the fucking Virginia Athletic Commission guy out one night in Richmond because he was letting the WWF come into the state and run against Crockett, who'd been there for 30 years and supported all those athletic commissions. So, it's not hyperbole to say that people just rejected the different style. It was the same thing when Vince had bought the Atlanta TV, and it's been documented that people were calling in the station, we want our Gordon Soley wrestling. What the fuck is this? We don't understand this. This is not what we want. And I think Vince took it personally, and that's what gave a little more juice to the war between him and Crockett, was that he was hearing from a lot of people. The Southern people want their Southern wrestling. They don't like this shit. And Vince did not like hearing that his wrestling was not the best in the world in every way. But anyway, it's a tribute to Crockett Sr. and to Jimmy for that last 15 years where he did take the company bigger than it had ever been before. But that they put something together like that so many people still look fondly on. And the Carolinas, the people that grew up there, the reunions always do better. Independent wrestling with the stars from those days always does better. I was on some of those big-time wrestling shows a couple years ago in the Carolinas, just the Rock and Roll Express, me, Baby Doll, whoever. The people go insane because it was their childhoods on a widespread basis. Probably second in the United States only to the city of Memphis itself as to where wrestling was more popular per capita in an area than any place else in the country. And look at what we just saw on All Friends Wrestling. Who are the legends? There was Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson on, national television in 2021 based on what they did working for Jimmy Crockett that impressed everybody, including the billionaire Money Mark 30 years ago. So I've said this also before. Dusty would have got restless or wanted to go to Florida or wanted to do something at some point, or some change would have been made. And because I was the youngest one there and I was willing to fucking, walk through hell with gasoline britches on, if Crockett had lasted into the 90s, I would have ended up booking that promotion sooner or later. And I would have loved that because those buildings and those towns and those people, it was wrestling fucking heaven. And I can't see, with all those things not having changed, and if TBS hadn't bought the company and sports entertainment become a thing and all the 90s gone to shit and the territories died, I can't imagine, unless they just fired me, I would have never left Jim Crockett Promotions. And I can't imagine them firing me because that's probably the one company that until TBS got involved, I never had a single crossword with any of those people. Because we were making a fortune. It was the best wrestling show on the planet, and I was happy to be there. There was no reason to complain or yell at anybody. Anyway, we send our sympathies out to David and Francis and all of Jimmy's family and friends, and Jackie. Jackie was always my favorite Crockett. I just saw him last year when we went to Charlotte for the NWA pay-per-view. They were there then, by the way, as a matter of fact. Between wrestling and the minor league hockey team and the minor league baseball team and the Harlem Globetrotter shows, almost every traveling show for 40 years was promoted in that area by the Crockett's. So people still remember them that never saw a wrestling match. Anyway, I don't know what else to say.